About a week ago, I put out my videos where I went through every single NBA team and identified the player on each squad that I believed was the most overrated by the general public at the moment. That's obviously a pretty contentious topic that can be heavily debated, so in order to bring things back to a more positive light, I'm going to do the opposite end of the spectrum for today's video. Today, we're once again going through all 30 NBA teams, and we'll be picking out the most underrated player from each team now. Meaning these are the players that are much better than the general consensus about them seems to be, and they deserve more credit for what they contribute. Before we start though, it turns out a good amount of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but it also very much appreciated. Now with that being said, let's begin. We'll start with the teams in the Eastern Conference, then go over to the Western Conference. So the first team up is the Atlanta Hawks, and their most underrated player right now is Jalen Johnson. There doesn't seem to be much positivity shown towards the disappointing Hawks this season, but Jalen Johnson has been one of the few bright spots breaking out in a big way. After barely being involved during his first two seasons, he has become an incredible two-way player, scoring 16 points per game, grabbing 9 rebounds, and attacking the basket well, and while doing that, he's also playing good versatile defense, and very well could be a star in the making right now. Next is the Boston Celtics, and their most underrated player right now is Al Horford. Horford's been Mr. Reliable for the Celtics for pretty much the entirety of his tenure there, and even though he's now coming off the bench, he's still filling gaps wherever necessary when he's on the court. He's still a top-notch interior defender, he's knocking down 41% of his threes, and despite his game not really being flashy, and the team's starting lineup being star-studded, he's one of the keys to their team making a deep run this year. Next is the Brooklyn Nets, and their most underrated player right now is Cam Thomas. Thomas started to explode onto the scene as a scorer last season, but his role came and went way too frequently for him to be consistent. This season, Thomas is a starter, he's scoring over 21 points per game on the season, and is doing what many knew he was capable of, yet he seems to be doing so in a way that's flying under the radar. Next is the Charlotte Hornets, and their most underrated player is Vasilij Micić. Micić came to the NBA this year after building a highly esteemed EuroLeague resume that included him being named the MVP over there, along with being a EuroLeague champion twice. He started the season on the Oklahoma City Thunder actually, but they couldn't find a consistent role for him and traded him to Charlotte, where he is now starting in the absence of LaMelo Ball and is proving that he's NBA caliber talent with ease. Up next is the Chicago Bulls, and their most underrated player is Ayo Dosunmu. Dosunmu originally worked his way into the team's rotation for his work as a perimeter defender in his first two seasons, but offensively his contributions came and went. This season though, he's taken huge strides on the offensive end, scoring a career-high 12 points per game, shooting 40% from 3, and making more of an impact creating with the ball in his hands. Next is the Cleveland Cavaliers, and their most underrated player is Sam Merrill. I actually recently made an entire video about Merrill, so go watch it after you watch this one, but basically Merrill has finally settled into a consistent role with the Cavaliers, and his work as a lethal sharpshooter is shining through. When he's in the game, he's going to let it fly from 3, and he's knocking down 41% of his shots from deep, so he will make you pay. Up next is the Detroit Pistons, and their most underrated player is Jalen Duren. There hasn't been a whole lot going right for the Pistons this year, so they're not usually in the spotlight unless it's for the wrong reasons, but Duren's development in year 2 is very promising as one of the better young centers. He's a double-double machine, scoring 14 points and grabbing 12 rebounds per game, he scores very efficiently inside, and he's looking like a legit anchor for them for years to come. Next is the Indiana Pacers, and their most underrated player is Aaron Nesmith. Nesmith was a lottery pick made by the Celtics back in 2020, but he never found his footing in Boston, so they traded him to Indiana. Since his arrival on the Pacers, he's begun to show why he was viewed as lottery talent for his sharpshooting capabilities, and is now a reliable floor-spacing starter, scoring 12 points per game, making a ridiculous 44% of his three-point shots. Up next is the Miami Heat, and their most underrated player is Bam Adebayo. Adebayo seems to be one of the most underrated players every season because with all of the inconsistencies of a typical Miami Heat regular season, he remains the one constant for them. He's a 20-point scorer, grabbing a career high in rebounds this year as well. His skill in the post and with his face-up game improves every season, and year in and year out, he's one of the best defenders in the entire NBA without getting any Defensive Player of the Year hype, making him pretty underrated in my opinion. Next is the Milwaukee Bucks, and their most underrated player is Brook Lopez. The Bucks defense may not be as great this year as it was last year, but Brook Lopez is the one that holds things together for them inside, and his work as a floor-spacing big man continues to be an underrated aspect of his game. The Bucks are 7.7 points better with him on the court versus when he's on the bench for a reason, because he's the glue that does a lot of the little things for this Bucks team. Up next is the New York Knicks, and their most underrated player is Josh Hart. Hart is basically a jack-of-all-trades role player that can fill into almost any role you ask of him, and he'll give you positive minutes there. He's a terrific defender, he's arguably the best rebounding wing player in the entire NBA, crashing the glass as hard as anybody and grabbing 8 rebounds per game. He's a smart playmaker who can handle the ball a bit, and he can even be a secondary scoring option when necessary. Up next is the Orlando Magic, and their most underrated player is Franz Wagner. The Magic are, as a whole, pretty underrated as a group, on track to make the playoffs despite getting almost zero national recognition. And with Franz Wagner developing into a reliable 20-point scorer for the 4 seed in the East, you would think he would be included in more of the conversations about the top talent in the NBA right now coming through the ranks. Next is the Philadelphia 76ers, and their most underrated player is Joel Embiid. It may sound crazy to call the reigning MVP of the league underrated, but it's hard to ignore how much negativity is thrown out there about Embiid anytime he's brought up as a topic of conversation by the average fan. He's easily one of the most hated on athletes in the league today, and now since his knee injury, we're seeing just how much he was almost single-handedly responsible for keeping the team together, as they have been one of the worst teams in the NBA since he went down. Up next is the Toronto Raptors, and their most underrated player is Gary Trent Jr. Trent isn't always a go-to option on offense, but game after game, he's one of the most consistent shooters in the league, knocking down 41% of his shots from deep this season. He's come off the bench for large stretches this year, he's started just as many games for them when needed, and no matter where they've put him, he's provided consistently on the offensive end. Next up is the Washington Wizards, and their most underrated player is Deni Avdija. Avdija may not be in the running to win this year's Most Improved Player award, but he is definitely one of the most improved players this season. This is his 4th year in the league, and he's putting up a career-high 14 points per game, and has finally found his footing as a shooter, making a career-high 51% of his shots and 39% of his threes, and he's gotten better and better this season as it has progressed, even dropping 43 points in a game against the Pelicans last month. Now over to the Western Conference teams. Next up is the Dallas Mavericks, and their most underrated player is Daniel Gafford. Gafford was a pretty underrated player when he was on the Wizards, and since he's been traded to Dallas, he's been fitting in perfectly. He is a pretty perfect example of a quality player that doesn't get much attention when they're on a bad team, but then when they go to a good team, their impact becomes very noticeable. Next is the Denver Nuggets, and their most underrated player is Aaron Gordon. The Nuggets' championship core is back looking to make another run to defend their title this year, and with Nikola Jokic on track to win another MVP, and Jamal Murray inevitably expected to step his game up in the playoffs, it's Aaron Gordon who does a lot of the dirty work to take this team to the next level. He's their best defender, and he has amazing chemistry with Nikola Jokic cutting off the ball, making their lives much easier. Next is the Golden State Warriors, and their most underrated player is Jonathan Kuminga. Kuminga is taking a legitimate star-caliber leap before our very eyes, and yet, due to the Warriors' struggles and inconsistencies, he hasn't been getting quite the flowers that he probably deserves for it. Over the last 2 months, Kuminga is averaging 21 points per game, getting to the basket at will, showing off a much improved post game, and is even knocking down more threes per game. And after struggling to earn Coach Steve Kerr's trust in his career early on, he's now one of the team's most important players on both ends of the floor. Up next is the Houston Rockets, and their most underrated player is Jalen Green. Jalen Green gets a lot of criticism, and some of the time it's justified because he can definitely play a bit out of control and take some bad shots more often than he should, but I've seen a lot of people trying to call him a bust this season, and that's just simply taking things too far. Green is still scoring 19 points per game this year. He's had more 30-point games before the age of 21 than all but 5 players in NBA history, and he's trending in the right direction. Next is the Los Angeles Clippers, and their most underrated player is James Harden. The saga he put himself through early in the year led to a lot of early criticism, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't contribute to it a bit, but since then he settled in very nicely with the Clippers and has been a key catalyst to them shooting up the standings. He's taken control of the offense, distributing easy looks to those around him, he's been getting the most out of Kawhi Leonard, and he's actually shooting better from 3 than he ever has in his career, making 40% of his shots from deep, in the reduced role he's in now, so that's probably helping him. Up next is the Los Angeles Lakers, and their most underrated player is D'Angelo Russell. D'Lo was getting the scapegoat treatment early this season, even getting benched for a brief stretch, but he's back, he put his head down and worked his way into the trust of his coaches and teammates, and is low-key having one of the best seasons of his career. He's shooting better than he ever has, knocking down 47% of his shots and 42% of his threes. He's playing his best basketball in the second half of the season again like he did last year, and he's hoping to ignite another playoff push like last season too. Next is the Memphis Grizzlies, and their most underrated player is Vince Williams. The Grizzlies season was kind of doomed from the jump, but the plus side of that happening has been that they've been having the ability to give a lot of players the chance to earn some stripes, and Vince Williams has been a diamond in the rough. He's just a really solid all-around player who can handle the ball, make smart passes, knock down threes, and defend hard, and next season when the team is back healthy again, he'll undoubtedly be involved still. Up next is the Minnesota Timberwolves, and their most underrated player is Naz Reid. The Timberwolves notably have a starting lineup with 2 centers already pairing up, but they also have one of the best backup big men behind Gobert and Towns, as Naz Reid subs in and provides even more offensive firepower. He's one of the most skilled bigs in the league, with explosive athleticism, a jumper that falls at 41% clip from deep, and good touch at the basket too. Next is the New Orleans Pelicans, and their most underrated player is Zion Williamson. The Zion narrative has become so overwhelmingly negative that he lands on this list because a lot of it is just not true at this point. He's finally back healthy, he's in better shape than he's been in years, he's fully bought into what the Pelicans are doing, and he's been playing a huge role in the Pelicans' charge up the standings, as they are now in 5th place, right behind the Clippers. Up next is the Oklahoma City Thunder, and their most underrated player is Jalen Williams. J-Dub isn't the flashiest player, but he's quickly becoming one of the best young players in the league, and he does a little bit of everything for the first place Thunder. He's a ridiculously efficient scorer inside and out, putting up 19 points per game, he's one of their best defenders, and he's even a good passer for a forward as well, with the kind of talent that could see him making an all-star game sooner rather than later. Next is the Phoenix Suns, and their most underrated player is Grayson Allen. Allen's typically viewed as just a spot-up shooter who can produce in a limited role, but on the Suns, he's become so much more. He's leading the entire NBA this year in three-point shooting, making a ridiculous 48% of his three-point shots. And with how lethal he's been from beyond the arc, there have been plenty of games where he's been able to have huge scoring nights attacking the basket too, because teams are overextending on him now. Up next is the Portland Trail Blazers, and their most underrated player is Scoot Henderson. People don't seem to be willing to give Henderson any time to develop or any room to make mistakes in his rookie season. He definitely hasn't been efficient this year, but historically, barely any rookie guards ever are, and he's been improving game by game, including a 30-point outing against the Denver Nuggets. So while some are already labeling him as a bust, I still see lots of potential there. Next is the Sacramento Kings, and their most underrated player is Domantas Sabonis. Sabonis is like a watered-down version of Nikola Jokic, which is still a really damn good player, but because we see what Nikola Jokic does on a regular basis, he doesn't quite get the same attention. He's one of the most skilled big men in the NBA today, dishing out over 8 assists per game, he's leading the NBA in rebounding, and he's scoring 20 points per game on top of it, orchestrating the Kings' offense beautifully on the way to another playoff appearance. Next is the San Antonio Spurs, and their most underrated player is Devin Vassell. Vassell was originally drafted with the hopes of becoming a 3-and-D player, but 3 years into his career, he's showing so much more. He's a much better shot creator than initially advertised, scoring about 19 points per game this season, and is a reliable secondary scoring option to hold on to long-term next to Victor Wembanyama. And finally, the last team is the Utah Jazz, and their most underrated player is Colin Sexton. Sexton's potential got written off by many after his meniscus tear in 2021, but in Utah, he's rejuvenated his career and is back as a high-level scorer, putting up 19 points per game, shooting 49% from the field and 40% from 3. His non-stop aggressiveness and hyper-efficiency have never really gotten the props that they deserve. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below who you think are the most underrated players right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.